It is my pleasure to welcome now Chris Estes. Chris is the co-executive director of the Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group, or CSG. His current work is centered on the policy and program implications of the Thrive Rural Framework for Equitable Rural Prosperity. Chris's previous work includes rural capacity building with the Housing Assistance Council, serving as interim executive director of the Raleigh-Wake, North Carolina, Partnership to End Homelessness, and as a senior advisor at a national network providing home repair to low-income homeowners in disaster recovery. Chris was also the president and CEO of the National Housing Conference in Washington, D.C., serving as a national thought leader on affordable housing and community development issues, including the intersection of housing with transportation, education, and health. Chris originally came to D.C. from North Carolina, where he led the North Carolina Housing Coalition, as well as worked on early childhood issues and programs serving children and families. Welcome, Chris, and thank you for being here. And that is a clicker if you need it.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to walk and talk because I do better than standing by a podium. So it's great to be with you all. I know I've been here since the first day and seen and met many of you. It's very exciting for me to be here. What wasn't in my bio is that I was actually born just down the road in Greenfield, Mass. Went to elementary school in Gill, Massachusetts. So I actually am sort of a dual citizen. I used to tell people I was bilingual, that I had lived most of my youth in New England and most of my college and adult life in North Carolina, so I could speak both Southern and New England at the same time. But it's really great to be here. I have many great memories. My father taught at a prep school called Northfield Mount Herman, and we used to bring students up to Mount Monadnock all the time, and in many fond memories of hiking that mountain as a kid. Although as a third grader, it definitely felt like it was a long way to go. So I'm going to talk with you about a variety of things that I'm going to try to connect to what's really happening in rural and resources for you. So I'm going to throw kind of a lot at you as a way to kind of generate thought and for you to dive into stuff that hopefully will help your work. If you want to click on this QR code, it'll take you to our website where you can see a lot of the resources I'm going to talk about because we really don't have time to do a deep dive. So as Juliana mentioned, I am a co-director of the Aspen Community Strategies Group. We've been around since 1985 at the Aspen Institute. We are the one program that really focuses on comprehensive community development, and 2/3 of our work historically and 100% of our work over the last 7 or 8 years has been in rural. We have a long history of working directly with practitioners to facilitate peer learning and synthesize those learnings to share with the field. We've done a lot of work with community development foundations and impact investing in rural, and really trying to be what we call a hub of hubs, really trying to identify all the resources that are happening in rural around the country and share that with folks, connect people to one another, and build and grow the field of equitable rural prosperity. So these are the topics I'm going to hit on, and it's a little odd because I'll be going from bottom to top. I realized as I put this slide together, I'm going to go in the opposite direction. But the idea is to try to connect with what we've learned about frameworks that can help folks in their work, and then connect them to what we feel like are some of the big opportunity issues for folks in rural to connect to. So if somebody asked me how would I define my sort of religious philosophy, my work philosophy, and what I think is the most important thing in rural, it really is 2 words: interdependence and interconnectedness. And I think for most folks in New England, this is probably kind of preaching to the choir, but it's really this idea that we have often thought about our issues and our communities in silos. And I mean that in the community sense too, that regionalism is hard, broader thinking is hard, and I'll go into this in more depth, but everything will try to connect back to these two concepts. So the first framework that CSG was a part of starting back in 2008 was this idea called WealthWorks. And it was really building off the academic research that had started in the 90s about assets and capitals and understanding, moving from a conversation about income into a conversations about wealth and assets. And CSG came in to work with a group of practitioners to really identify these 8 capital, to devise a framework that helped people look at their community and say, what do we have in these 8 capitals in our community? And how would we actually develop a plan for local wealth development in expanding these capitals and furthering sort of, again, from a local wealth creation, not an extraction philosophy, which is really the dominant framework in rural throughout the United States. You can find more on WealthWorks on our website, but it really became the underpinning of the approach of how we were trying to share stuff with people. The idea is that you explore from your region about how to create local wealth, identify a market opportunity, create a value chain, and build and then measure your wealth building impact from both the wealth and jobs it's created, but also community well-being. And this is a different approach. Again, it's not, we've often had the answer of like jobs were simply the problem. We need jobs. If people were employed, that kind of answered everything. And I think we've all realized, certainly in the last 20 years, that employment doesn't equal housing, doesn't equal childcare, doesn't equal health care. It doesn't solve the cost of living for a lot of people. So from that work, Janet Topolsky, who ran this program for 29 years, and Catherine Ferguson, who is now the Chief of Staff at USDA, worked on this project called our Rural Development Hubs Report. And if you remember 2 things, it's that slide about interdependence and interconnectedness, and hopefully this Hubs Report, because this is really where we tried to encapsulate all the stuff we had learned about where innovation and opportunity was happening in rural. And what we realized was that there were certain kinds of organizations in rural places that made the biggest difference. And this and the next slide sort of go through the things that made them unique. The first thing was, and this was kind of radical at Radically Rural, was that people were thinking regionally. They weren't just operating in one local community. And I know regionally means different things in different places. A region in New Hampshire is certainly different than a region in New Mexico or Wyoming. They take the long view. Most importantly, they analyze the systems level and the gaps in the systems. They are a place where people come together, figure out what's working in their community and where the gaps are, and work to be a table to bring and bridge and build capacity to solve those issues. These collaboration as an essential way of being and doing, take and tolerate risk. One of the challenges in rural is that most lending and investment strategies view rural as too risky. There's not enough economies of scale, there's not enough sort of traditional sense of assets. And so having an institution or an organization that can really understand and be one who can take that risk, because local governments are never going to be able to fill that gap. And finally, and most importantly, hold themselves accountable to the whole community. If you read this report, you can see examples from all over the country about this. It isn't one, this aren't just CDFIs, they aren't just community foundations. It can really be a whole variety of organizations and institutions. This concept and that previous work led to the creation of our Thrive Rural framework. And this is far too much stuff to try to, I could do a 2-hour workshop on this, but I wanted you to be able to see it on our website. The framework was really a work of 2 years of talking to practitioners and working groups about what had to be true to get to equitable rural prosperity. And what people told us came into being in the form of these building blocks. Each one of these is a thing that had to be true. And that we realized that we needed a local level theory of change and a systems level theory of change. Local being the things that are within the control of the community, and systems being the things that are outside the direct control but impact. We've organized these into 3 buckets that sort of talked about voice and power, aims and design, and resources. And we realized that there wasn't a building block just for equity, that we needed to have a foundational element that identified and pointed towards dismantling structural discrimination based on race, place, and class. And this is and ironically, the controversy of this element in terms of as we've rolled this out, and particularly among philanthropy, sadly, is that people don't see place as a structural barrier, particularly when it comes to rural. And the irony of this, if you sort of bridge the rural-urban gap, we have long accepted that zip code is an indicator of life expectancy in urban communities. You've been a lot of research, particularly for communities of color, but when it came to rural, we were getting pushback from the so-called progressive left, philanthropy-serving organizations saying, well, rural people can just move. And that's a direct quote. I'm not trying to be dramatic. We literally had editors of I won't say who it was or the organization, but we've really had to push back on this. And I think it's important for folks in rural to understand that part of the challenge we have is that how people view rural and its challenges and its solutions is still in this kind of zero sum. If this isn't great for you, you should go somewhere else. Now, we've gotten into long debates about, do you understand the history of African American communities in rural, land owned by families from the time of Reconstruction? You're telling them that they've held on to this for 8 generations and they should just walk away. Like, that's an equity issue and you're not owning that. And that somewhat gets the lights to come on, but this is a big challenge. So what this framework does is it's designed to help connect issues. It's a conceptual things that need to be present. And there's a whole path that you can walk through on the website about analyzing what issue is it that we're trying to solve? How does it show up in these building blocks? Where are we doing well? Where are some things that we might be missing? How we connect with different organizations that do that work. And it's really a way to, you can take stock of the issues in your community, you can gauge progress of where you are, or you can measure impact wherever you are in that life cycle of planning and implementation. Each of the building blocks has its own a page on the website with definitions, research behind it, why it's been proven academically to sort of be important to community development, and then there's resources under it about what it looks like in action. So I'm going to hit a couple of reports and sort of try to connect this theme. So one of the challenges in rural is that the way we're asked to measure success is overwhelmingly urban biased and generally towards, I think, a deficit framework of jobs created, dollars leveraged. And that inhibits rural communities from getting the kind of investments both at the scale and flexibility that it needs. So we did a whole report called Measure Up, How to Measure Success in Rural. And the way we do these reports is we convene 30 or 40 folks in small groups of 4 to 6 people, have a discussion facilitated by emergent learning, asking this sort of what will it take question. And then we synthesize that into a set of principles and recommendations for practitioners, government, and philanthropy. So almost every issue that we've talked about and a lot of the work that I've been doing with Tony that you heard about yesterday morning really centers on this idea of how do we get the federal government to measure rural differently. And I think it also applies to state and even local concepts. I'm just going to hit a couple of high notes across this and you can see quotes from people. You heard this a little bit if you were in the entrepreneurial track. Understanding and we include Native and tribal and indigenous communities in our rural work, and they're in every discussion we have. But this notion of success itself is really different in Native tribal communities, this idea of wealth. And Janice is one of the people that we've gotten to know and work closely with, and her work has been especially important in the recovery of the Maui fires. Her husband is actually leading the emergency management response in Maui. But this notion, she really blew us away with this idea of abundance. And I think it's an important concept, again, when you're coming from a deficit framework and thinking about what's wrong and what's missing, and you end up missing the sort of all the strengths that you're, particularly the social capital in your community. This idea that communities should have a voice in deciding what they want to measure. And I'll go back to you always end up working towards what you're measuring. So if your goals are always sort of output related, you're going to miss an opportunity to sort of push yourself into deeper work. I'll point out an example, like if you were trying to drive, for example, an economy towards outdoor recreation, which I'll talk about in a second, and the goals, the things that you measure are sort of heads and beds, number of visitors, dollars spent, but you don't measure, like, how did we change the local wealth creation within our community? You won't drive towards a local wealth creation strategy. You'll be totally built on an extraction framework. So this idea of starting where people are and understanding how to measure success from those points and this relative change is a huge issue and opportunity for rural. We can't ever win the volume game. We won't ever be at scale, but if you can show percentage change in your impact, then you can really show funders, including the federal government, the opportunities to invest in rural and see real change. I will highlight, I guess, this idea that one of the things that's always missing from almost every grant is this measure and decrease in equity. And again, there's an opportunity, especially in rural, to identify the historic inequities in rural places. These are especially true in the Southeast and Southwest with the histories of slavery and abuse of people of color and native tribal folks. And so if you're not getting at that, you're really not addressing the foundational issues. Measuring collaboration, another radical concept, and the sense of momentum and progress is another piece that you see in the framework as well. We often get caught in rural of the spread it around strategy. Well, instead of being able to decide who's really doing great work and we should invest in, it's like everybody should get the same thing. That may be egalitarian, but it does miss out on the opportunities to really support folks who are doing the right kind of community engagement and measurement. I'll talk briefly, or just a moment, about health equity and measurement. We have a report that we're working on right now that's really asking what will it take to get rural health and rural development fields to become more aligned and particularly share measurements of success. Often those things are in very different camps. Development is all about economic activity and employment. Health, maybe about well-being and reduction of illness, and those things are never linked. And if you think about the history of the kinds of development that happen in rural places, particularly in extractive communities, those things have often been at opposite and opposed to each other. And we hope to have that piece coming out in the next month or two. But this idea that we talk about health separately is a theme that I want to keep coming back to. We should never have conversations, single issue conversations in silos. Those things always need to be together. The climate, disaster, energy conversation, there's folks talking about it here. Those conversations are opportunities for different ways of thinking about community development, different opportunities to invest in community resilience. Instead of using an insurance model, we could be thinking about how is this an opportunity to do community development differently? Instead of just building back things the way they were in that sort of assurance framework, make everybody quote unquote whole, we could be thinking about what's been missing that led to the impact of this disaster being worse and invest differently. And we really want to feel like there's a huge opportunity for change there given the continual increasing the number of natural disaster incidents. We spend more money in this country on housing from disaster recovery than we do in housing to produce more housing stock. And that's been true for 20 years. It's why all the housing organizations the field I used to work in, have all moved to disaster recovery because that's where the money is. Now just think about that for a second. We're spending all the money building back, but we aren't necessarily building back in a better way. I don't want to get caught up with that acronym, but. The other piece that is a constant theme is this notion of local and regional capacity. When money came from the Biden administration over the last 4 years, most rural places did not have the capacity to do it, to take it, to apply for it, to manage it, worried about not being able to do it and being audited and, all of that stuff. Not just governments, but nonprofits. And disaster recovery, if you do it, is the idea of like, how could we leave this place having built more capacity? It's a unique opportunity to really invest in institutions and organizations. Outdoor recreation. Again, this conversation, there's a massive conversation happening about climate. There's a massive conversation right now in rural generally about outdoor rec as an economic driver, particularly since COVID. But those things are not happening in a community development framework, and particularly not with a rural community development framework orientation in the way it needs to be. So we did a piece on outdoor rec, really like what's missing. The most important thing is, I think, first approaching from a local ownership framework. Once a place becomes successful, and you can look just across the border at the ski areas in Vermont, once a place becomes a destination, outside money's going to come in and own everything. Even if you've got local owners, the chances of those folks hanging on and staying local and selling to another local person in the community versus selling to a restaurant group or an investment group is pretty low. And pretty soon, what you've got is an economy that's much more tourism, that offers low-wage jobs for your residents, priced out of the housing market, so they're now driving further away, and all the wealth leaves the community. Most people get caught by this because they're so used to seeing a deficit and they're desperate for people to come that they don't see it. You sort of spend all this time like, if we can just get these people here, if this will just happen, well, this is going well. And then you kind of like go over the edge and like, oh my God, no one can afford to live here. How did that happen? And I literally last week was in Western North Carolina at the Outdoor Economy Conference, and this was a major topic of consideration, and it's a struggle for the industry. They are having a hard time pivoting because the tourism side, the way they measure success is heads and beds. It's like, get people here, and they know how to market. So outdoor tourism is not marketing. It's about developing your local economy and your local ownership. It's about looking at the infrastructure you need. What kind of transportation are we going to need? What kind of childcare are we going to have? What kind of housing market do we need? And knowing that once a place becomes desirable, you're never going to be able to build enough housing to keep up with it because there's only so much land to build on, and the second home market and everything else will take over. So it's really about setting land aside to be permanently affordable. Again, not going to be a solution probably in the next 4 years where we're going to see a huge influx of federal money towards housing, so it's all going to be a conversation about land use. And I know that's a touchy subject in many New England places, as it is in many rural outdoor economy places, but that's sort of going to be our message over and over. You got to do the hard work of saying, how do we set aside land, put it in a community land trust, make sure it's permanently affordable? What's the publicly owned land we can utilize? Because once it's gone and it's built on, you don't get it back. If you aren't familiar with the Pennsylvania wilds and you're in New England, I encourage you to really check out this effort. It's a huge regional effort to develop a very rural part of north and central Pennsylvania that's the size of Massachusetts. And it's all about sort of a kind of ecotourism that's centered around local, small places with maker economies and variety of, using state parks, using people who want to tour on motorcycles and visit cute spots, like a whole gamut of stuff. And Ta's actually writing a book about this experience that I'm reading to make a quote on, but it's really an amazing story, and I encourage you to visit it. The final piece I'll mention and this is really an opportunity where the environmental movement and the economic development movement need to come together, is this idea of sustainability within how we use our natural, whether it's outdoor rec or just the natural resources of our rural places. And too often those conversations haven't happened because I think in particular the environmental side of things have seen development as the enemy. Developers were kind of running amok. We have to stop that, fight it, none of that. That's the only answer, is to play defense. And the folks who were working on affordable housing or community development were like, no, but we do need this kind of growth. We need to have something here because we have problems in our housing market or our workforce housing. And we've not come together. And I think outdoor rec in this sort of broader view of sustainability and development and trying to grow local ownership is the opportunity for that. Again, when you have those conversations in silos, you find that the enemy is us, to quote Pogo, if you're old enough to remember that. I will mention that one of the things that happens in outdoor rec, and you may not have seen this as much here, but often it becomes a situation where the people in local communities don't actually benefit from those outdoor amenities. They don't get the health benefits. It's either expensive or prohibitive or not welcoming, and this is especially true in communities of color that haven't always been welcome in outdoor spaces, usually had segregated parks, segregated beaches, segregated lakes, or lake access, and there's a long history of that, particularly throughout the South and Southwest. But this idea of intentionally planning for inclusivity and welcoming, and a sense of like, how are you gonna program so that kids in your community who live there are able to participate in whatever the outdoor amenities and experience and benefits that are in your community. And again, when your focus is all about drawing folks here and generating that business income, this becomes like the 10th thing people start thinking about, and usually once you've gotten to it, it's really difficult to make it happen. So I'm going to close with some general strategies for rural. Again, interconnectedness and interdependence. We have to think about these things even within the tracks themselves, and Tony and I will talk about this at the end of the day. It feels like, how do we get these conversations between these groups? People working on entrepreneurism, people working on climate change, people working on small business development or arts and culture. No siloed conversations. The conversation about rural is a big one, an important one, and we are all suffering from a bad narrative. If you imagine how the country sees rural, it is generally in the context of the opioid Rust Belt, or it's Mayberry and the perfect ideal image of the farmer and the barn. We actually have a rule at CSG: you will never see us use a picture of a barn, because we know it's not against farmers, it's not against small farmers in particular, but that image is out there. People understand that. What they miss is what downtown Keene looks like. You know, they don't see a small town. Ironically, who here watches Hallmark movies? A few. You guys are a little too elite for Hallmark. The one media source that puts rural out there in a positive light is Hallmark. And what's interesting is my wife and I would joke about this, and I kept saying, like, are they ever gonna let like LGBT people show up in this? And they have done that, so much so that the director of Hallmark left and started his own rival channel to keep things pure. It's called the Great American Channel. It's on your network. But that was a direct reaction to Hallmark actually showing people of color and LGBTQ people in rural having romantic connections and whatever in a rural space. It was pretty amazing to watch, but I don't dismiss it because it does shape how the way we think about rural is a problem. The way we talk about rural is a problem. My one advice is we always start with the negative. We don't feel like people are paying attention. We don't feel like, and the way we do that is we try to tell you how bad it is. Here are the numbers, here's the problem, here's what we don't have, here's how bad our outcomes are. So what I learned in the affordable housing world, because we did this all the time, was instead of getting you fired up to like, oh my God, I gotta do something about this, people go, man, that seems like a big unsolvable problem, I'm gonna move on to something else. And that's exactly what happened. We had to realize that we had to lead with solutions, and we had to lead with opportunities. You gotta be honest about what we need, but we don't sell the opportunities for innovation and investment and all the great work that you and all the folks are doing across the country. Be inclusive is more than an invitation to the table. It's about building trust with people. And that's particularly whether that's new immigrants. Thank you. If you're in New England, that may be new immigrant populations. It may be people moving from other places within the US. But it's really about having a conversation. It's not about, hey, come to this meeting and give us your thoughts. It's like, what does your community need? What are the challenges? What's not working? What are your goals? What are your concerns? I had a long conversation with folks doing work in Asheville, North Carolina, and they were trying to do complete streets and bike lanes and sort of making the city more livable. And their enemy, in a sense, the people who were pushing back against them, was the African American community. And they were struggling to figure that out. And I said, well, think about it. They've been here since the end of the Civil War, and they're seeing their community gentrified and their people displaced. So when they see bike lanes, that's like, you want white people to come here and price us out. So you've got to have a conversation and understand their concerns about their preservation of their community and how this investment isn't going to create a greater displacement. And I would also, as an aside, don't ever conflate gentrification with displacement. We want our communities to be better. We want our quality of life to be better. What we don't want is for people to be pushed out. So don't get caught in that, like, the way to keep our community affordable is to keep it crappy. That's not a solution. Finally, Tony, for those of you who were here yesterday, you saw Tony's spaghetti slide of the massive chaos. There's a huge opportunity because that just got worse. All the programs that came out in the last 4 years, Tony and I were talking about, I think there's like now 34 more blocks added to that slide. We're not going to see more money, but we have a huge opportunity to try to maybe reorganize that stuff and make it less of a morass to deal with, change the outcomes that those organizations use to give out grants and make money more accessible and usable in rural places. And I think that's a big part of how we see our work ahead. Final thing, momentum is a community development strategy, but it is the way you build community engagement. Celebrate your small wins. Think about how to keep bringing people into that sense of momentum and shared vision. Try not to have an us versus them dynamic. People have talked about the polarization in our communities, but we all generally want the same thing. Yes, there are folks that don't want stuff to change, but there is a way to bring people in a real inclusivity to help them see and feel heard that is about each time you have a little momentum and a little success, people began to see, oh, there's a reason to have hope. Most of the folks we talk to, particularly in rural communities of color, there isn't much hope. There isn't much momentum. You heard the story of Drew, Mississippi. Like, that's an amazing story because they built on the goals and dreams of those young people and then created a sense of momentum that then brought adults in and other folks to say, hey, this might actually go somewhere. Every rural place, and particularly communities of color, has a long history of overpromise and underdeliver. And so we really believe this sense of momentum is a key strategy, but it's a real inclusive strategy. So I'm going to stop there and thank you all for this time and the opportunity to connect with you. I want to thank Juliana and the Radically Rural staff. I told her this morning the level of curation and detail and effort of this conference is really unprecedented. You may not realize that I go to a lot of conferences, and this is by far that level of curation and ways to engage the audience is unlike anything I've ever seen. And I really want to thank you all for that.